The summer heat hung thick over Willowbrook Plantation in 1847, but it wasn't the oppressive Louisiana humidity that made hearts race behind closed doors. In the grand manor house, where crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and silk curtains billowed in the breeze, a secret burned hotter than any southern sun. Master Richard Caldwell, respected landowner and pillar of society, harbored a shame that no amount of wealth could cure. His young wife Eleanor, 20 years his junior, had married duty and fortune, but found neither passion nor fulfillment in their marriage bed. The whispers started in the slave quarters first, as they always did, carried on the wind like dandelion seeds, impossible to contain. They spoke of Eleanor's lingering glances toward the fields, of how her eyes followed one man in particular as he worked shirtless under the merciless sun. They spoke of Samuel, whose powerful frame and quiet dignity set him apart, whose presence seemed to fill any room he entered. What began as stolen glances became stolen moments, and those moments became something far more dangerous. When Richard discovered the truth, the plantation held its breath, waiting for the violence that surely must follow. But what happened instead would prove far stranger than anyone could imagine in a world built on rigid hierarchies and brutal control. Three people were about to forge an arrangement that defied every rule of their society, an agreement born of desperation, desire, and a twisted kind of understanding that would bind them together in ways none of them could escape. The story of Willowbrook would become legend, whispered about for generations, though the truth would remain buried deeper than any secret the South had ever kept. This is that truth. Before we dive deeper into this forbidden tale, I want to hear from you. What do you think drove Eleanor to risk everything? Was it pure desire, loneliness, or something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story is about to take turns you won't believe. Make sure you're subscribed, because each chapter reveals darker secrets than the last. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when this delicate arrangement begins to unravel. Eleanor Beaumont had arrived at Willowbrook 3 years earlier, a vision in white lace and youthful hope. At 19, she'd been the belle of Charleston, her beauty celebrated at every ball and gathering. Richard Caldwell, at 42, had seemed like a dream match. Wealthy beyond measure, educated in Europe, cultured and refined. Her parents had practically glowed with pride at the union. The wedding had been the social event of the season, with 500 guests and champagne flowing like water. But wedding nights revealed truths that courtship carefully conceals. Richard had been gentle, apologetic, and utterly unable to consummate their marriage. He'd tried, God knows he tried, but his body simply wouldn't cooperate. The shame in his eyes that first night had been devastating to witness. Eleanor, innocent and confused, had assured him it didn't matter, that they had time. But weeks became months, and months became years, and nothing changed. Richard threw himself into managing the plantation with even greater intensity, as if success in business could compensate for failure in the bedroom. Eleanor threw herself into the role of mistress of the house, organizing social events, managing the household staff, maintaining the appearance of a perfect marriage. But at night, alone in her vast bed, she felt the years of her youth slipping away like sand through her fingers. She was 22 years old, and had never known a man's touch beyond chaste kisses and fumbling attempts that led nowhere. The loneliness ate at her like a cancer, made worse by the fact that she genuinely cared for Richard. He was kind to her, generous, intellectually stimulating. He gave her everything except the one thing she craved. Samuel had come to Willowbrook 2 years ago, purchased at auction in New Orleans. Richard had paid top dollar for him, recognizing quality when he saw it. Samuel was educated and usual for an enslaved man. His previous owner had been a peculiar sort who believed in teaching his slaves to read and write, a practice that had scandalized his neighbors. When that owner died bankrupt, his assets were liquidated, and Samuel found himself on the auction. blocked despite his unique skills. Richard had immediately put him to work as a foreman, overseeing the other field workers. Samuel was 30 years old, stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, and possessed a quiet authority that made other men follow his lead without question. He was also, though no one would say it aloud, extraordinarily handsome. His features were strong and symmetrical, his body sculpted by years of hard labor into something resembling a Greek statue. Eleanor had noticed him immediately, though she'd trained herself not to stare. A white woman didn't look at enslaved men that way. It wasn't done. It was dangerous. It was unthinkable. But Eleanor found herself thinking about it anyway. At first, she told herself it was simple, aesthetic appreciation, the way one might admire a fine horse or a beautiful painting. But as months passed, her thoughts grew less innocent. She began finding excuses to walk past the fields during the hottest part of the day, when the men worked shirtless. She began requesting Samuel specifically when she needed heavy items moved in the house. She began to notice details, the way sweat gleamed on his dark skin, the corded muscles of his forearms, the deep timbre of his voice when he said, "Yes, ma'am." She felt ashamed of these thoughts, disgusted with herself. She was a married woman. He was enslaved. The power imbalance alone made any such thoughts monstrous. Yet the thoughts persisted, growing stronger, more insistent, until they invaded her dreams and left her gasping awake in the darkness, her body aching with unfulfilled need. The first time it happened, it wasn't planned. Eleanor would replay that afternoon 1,000 times in her mind, wondering if she could have stopped it, if she should have stopped it. She'd been in the library, a room Richard rarely used during the day. She'd called for someone to move a heavy bookcase, and Samuel had arrived. The house was quiet. The other servants were occupied elsewhere. They were alone. She directed him to the bookcase, and as he'd moved it, she'd found herself staring at the flex of his muscles, the power in his movements. He'd caught her looking. Their eyes had met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Eleanor's breath had caught. Samuel had frozen, the bookcase half moved. The air between them had felt electric, charged with possibility and danger. Eleanor had taken a step toward him, just one step, but it was enough. Samuel had set down the bookcase and taken a step toward her. They'd met in the middle of the room, and when his lips touched hers, Eleanor felt something inside her break open like a dam. She'd pulled him closer, desperate. 3 years of frustration and loneliness pouring out in that kiss. His hands had found her waist and moved lower, and she'd gasped against his mouth. They'd made love right there on the library floor, frantic and urgent. Eleanor's skirts hiked up around her waist. Samuel's pants barely lowered. It had been everything her wedding night wasn't. Passionate, primal, satisfying in ways she hadn't known were possible. Afterward, as reality crashed back in, they'd both been terrified. Samuel had pulled away, his eyes wide with fear. He knew what happened to enslaved men accused of touching white women. Eleanor had grabbed his arm, assured him she wanted it, that she wouldn't tell anyone. But they both knew how little her assurances meant. If anyone found out, Samuel would die, probably tortured first, as an example. Eleanor might be ruined, but she'd survive. Samuel, Wouldn, single quotes T. Yet despite the danger, despite the fear, they couldn't stay away from each other. What had started as a single moment of weakness became a regular affair. They were careful, meeting only when the house was quiet, only when they were certain of privacy. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in a house full of servants who saw everything. Richard found out 3 months later. One of the house slaves, perhaps hoping to curry favor, or perhaps genuinely concerned for her mistress's safety, had informed him of Eleanor's frequent private meetings with Samuel. Richard's first reaction had been rage, not at Eleanor, but at himself. He'd locked himself in his study for an entire day, drinking brandy and confronting the truth he'd been avoiding. His inability to satisfy his wife had driven her into another man's arms. When he finally emerged, he'd summoned Eleanor to his study. She'd gone pale when she saw his face, certain her life was about to end. But Richard hadn't shouted. He'd simply asked her if it was true. Eleanor, exhausted from months of sneaking and lying, had confessed everything. She'd expected fury, violence, divorce. Instead, Richard had started to cry. He told her he was sorry, that he'd failed her as a husband, that he understood why she'd sought comfort elsewhere. Eleanor had been stunned. She'd tried to comfort him, to assure him it wasn't his fault, but Richard had waved her off. He'd asked her a question that changed everything. "Does he make you happy?" Eleanor had hesitated, then nodded. Richard had been quiet for a long moment, then said something that shocked her to her core, then continue, "But be discreet." Eleanor had been certain she'd misheard, but Richard had been serious. He'd explained his reasoning. He loved her. He wanted her to be happy, and he couldn't give her what she needed. If Samuel could, then so be it. He had only two conditions: absolute discretion, and that he be allowed to seek his own satisfaction elsewhere. Eleanor had understood immediately what he meant. They were enslaved women on the plantation, young and powerless, who would have no choice but to submit to the master's desires. The arrangement had made Eleanor sick to her stomach. But what choice did she have? She was trapped in a marriage to a man who couldn't touch her, in love with a man she could never truly be with, living in a society that would destroy them all if the truth came out. So, she agreed. Richard had summoned Samuel to his study that same night. Samuel had arrived expecting to be killed. Instead, Richard had offered him a deal: continue the affair with Eleanor, keep her happy, and in exchange, Samuel would receive better treatment, easier work, and the promise that he'd never be sold away from Willowbrook. Samuel had been as shocked as Eleanor, but he agreed. What else could he do? He was enslaved. He had no real choice in any of this. And so, the strangest arrangement in Willowbrook's history had begun. By day, they maintained perfect appearances. Richard was the respected plantation owner, Eleanor, the gracious mistress of the house, Samuel, the hard-working foreman. But by night, the rules changed. Eleanor would slip away to a small cottage at the edge of the property, where Samuel would be waiting. They'd make love for hours, Eleanor finally experiencing the passion she'd craved for so long. Meanwhile, Richard began visiting the slave quarters, selecting young women to warm his bed. Perhaps the lack of pressure, the absence of a wife's expectations, made the difference. Or perhaps it was simply the power dynamic, the control he wielded over these women. Whatever the reason, Richard found he could perform with them in ways he never could with Eleanor. The plantation settled into this new, twisted rhythm. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Guests visited and remarked on what a handsome couple the Caldwells made. Eleanor hosted tea parties and charity events. Richard expanded his business interests and increased his wealth. But beneath the surface, in the shadows and secret places, a different reality existed. But could such an arrangement last? Could three people maintain such a dangerous secret in a world built on strict social hierarchies and brutal enforcement of racial boundaries? The answer, as they would all soon discover, was no, because secrets, like seeds, have a way of growing in the dark until they burst into the light, destroying everything in their path. The cottage where Eleanor and Samuel met had once housed the plantation's overseer, before Richard had built a larger residence closer to the main house. Now, it sat empty most of the time, small wooden structure surrounded by magnolia trees that provided privacy from prying eyes. Eleanor had furnished it simply but comfortably: a bed with clean linens, a wash basin, candles for light. It became their sanctuary, the one place in the world where they could be themselves without pretense or fear. In that cottage, Eleanor wasn't the plantation mistress, and Samuel wasn't enslaved. They were simply a man and a woman who'd found something rare and precious in each other. They'd talk for hours. Samuel sharing stories of his childhood, of the master who taught him to read, of the books he'd devoured in secret. Eleanor would tell him about Charleston's society, about the suffocating expectations placed on women of her class, about dreams she'd had to abandon when she married. Samuel had a sharp mind and a dry wit that made Eleanor laugh in ways she never did at society functions. He'd quote Shakespeare and debate philosophy. His intelligence a stark reminder of the waste and cruelty of the system that enslaved him. Eleanor found herself falling in love truly, in love for the first time in her life. It terrified her. Desire was one thing, but love was dangerous. Love made you vulnerable. Love made you want impossible things? Samuel was equally conflicted. He cared for Eleanor, deeply, perhaps loved her, but he couldn't forget the fundamental truth of their situation. She owned him. Technically Richard owned him, but it amounted to the same thing. Every moment of tenderness between them existed within a framework of brutal power imbalance. Eleanor could walk away from this arrangement anytime she wanted. Samuel couldn't. If he refused her, if he displeased her, his life could become infinitely worse. He wanted to believe her feelings were genuine, that what they shared transcended the master-slave dynamic. But how could he ever be certain? How could any enslaved person truly consent when refusal could mean death? These thoughts haunted him in the quiet moments, poisoning what should have been pure. Yet he kept coming back to the cottage, kept losing himself in her arms, because what else could he do? This arrangement, twisted as it was, gave him something he'd never had before, a measure of safety, of security. Richard had promised he'd never be sold, and Richard seemed to be a man of his word. For an enslaved man, that promise was worth almost anything. Meanwhile, Richard's own activities in the slave quarters had become regular. He'd selected 3 young women who rotated through his bed. Lily, barely 18, with skin the color of honey. Sarah, 22, and mother to 2 children. And Ruth, 19, and new to the plantation. None of them had any choice in the matter. When the master called, you came. That was the brutal reality of slavery. Richard told himself he was gentle with them, that he treated them well, gave them gifts and easier work assignments. He told himself this, made it different, made it better somehow. But he knew the truth. There was no such thing as consent when one person owned another. These women submitted because they had to, because refusal could mean being sold away from their children, being whipped, or worse. Richard tried not to think about it too deeply. He focused instead on the physical release, on the validation of his masculinity that he'd been denied with Eleanor. He could perform with these women, could lose himself in the act without the pressure and expectations that had paralyzed him with his wife. It was enough. It had to be enough. The arrangement continued for 8 months without major incident. There were close calls moments when servants seemed suspicious, or guests asked uncomfortable questions, but nothing that threatened to expose the truth. Eleanor grew more confident, more relaxed. She smiled more, laughed more. Guests remarked on how well marriage seemed to suit her, how she'd blossomed into a role as plantation mistress. If only they knew the real reason for her happiness. Samuel, too, found a strange kind of peace. His work was easier now, his position secure. He had food, shelter, and the closest thing to affection an enslaved man could hope for. He tried not to think about the future, about what would happen when Eleanor grew tired of him, or when Richard changed his mind about their arrangement. He lived in the present, savoring each stolen moment in the cottage. But the human heart is a complicated thing, and arrangements built on secrets and lies are inherently unstable. The first crack appeared when Lily, one of Richard's regular companions, became pregnant. This wasn't unusual on plantations. Masters frequently impregnated enslaved women, and the children born of such unions simply increased the owner's property. But Lily made the mistake of hoping for more. She approached Richard privately and asked if he would free her child, since it would be his dot. Richard had been horrified. Free the child, acknowledge it as his. The very idea was scandalous. He'd sent Lily away with a harsh rebuke, making it clear she was never to speak of such things again. But the damage was done. Lily, hurt and angry, began to talk. She told the other enslaved women about the master's impotence with his wife, about the strange arrangement that allowed the mistress to take a lover. The stories spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Soon, everyone knew. The enslaved people of Willowbrook watched their masters with new eyes, seeing the cracks in the facade of power and propriety. Samuel heard the rumors and immediately went to Eleanor. They met in the cottage, and for the first time, their conversation was tense. Frightened, if the enslaved people knew, how long before white neighbors found out? How long before someone used this information to destroy them all? Eleanor wanted to run away, to take Samuel and flee north to freedom. But Samuel knew how impossible that was. A white woman and an enslaved black man traveling together, they'd be caught within days. Eleanor would be returned to her family in disgrace, and Samuel would be killed. There was no escape, no happy ending waiting for them. They were trapped in a situation of their own making, and the walls were closing in. Richard, when informed of the spreading rumors, made a calculated decision. He called a meeting of all the enslaved people on the plantation and made a speech. He told them that anyone caught spreading malicious gossip about the master or mistress would be sold immediately to the harshest plantations in the deep South, where they worked prisoners until they died. It was a threat, pure and simple, and it worked. The open talk stopped, but the knowledge remained, a loaded gun, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to fire it. The arrangement continued, but the innocence was gone. Eleanor and Samuel's meetings became tinged with paranoia. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. Richard's visits to the slave quarters became more frequent, as if he was trying to assert his dominance, to remind everyone who held the power. The plantation, which had seemed so peaceful on the surface, was now a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came from an unexpected direction. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. At first, she was overjoyed, then immediately terrified. The child was obviously Samuel's. She and Richard had never successfully consummated their marriage, but how could she explain a pregnancy to the world? Richard would have to claim the child as his own. But what if it was born with features that made its true parentage obvious? What if it had dark skin or hair texture that couldn't be explained away? Eleanor confided in Richard, expecting anger or rejection. Instead, Richard surprised her again. He said they would claim the child as his, regardless of how it looked. If necessary, they'd say Eleanor had been assaulted by an enslaved man who had been caught and killed. It was a horrifying lie, one that would require them to murder an innocent person to maintain the deception. But Richard was willing to do it. He'd come too far, invested too much in this arrangement to let it fall apart now. Eleanor was sickened by the suggestion, but couldn't offer an alternative. Samuel, when told of the pregnancy, experienced a complex mix of emotions: joy at the thought of a child, terror at the danger it represented, and deep sadness that he could never acknowledge this child as his own. His son or daughter would grow up enslaved or white, depending on appearance. But either way, Samuel could never be a true father. The pregnancy progressed, and Eleanor's belly grew. Society ladies visited and congratulated her. Richard accepted cigars and backslaps from other planters, and everyone marveled at the happy couple finally starting a family. Only 3 people knew the truth, and they were bound together by secrets that could destroy them all. As Eleanor's due date approached, the tension at Willowbrook reached a breaking point. What would happen when the child was born? Would it look white enough to pass? Would Richard truly go through with his plan to murder an innocent enslaved man to cover their tracks? And how long could they continue this charade before everything came crashing down. The baby was born on a humid August night, delivered by a midwife who'd attended half the births in the parish. Eleanor had labored for 14 hours, screaming and sweating in the grand bedroom while Richard paced downstairs and Samuel worked in the fields, unable to be anywhere near the house. Without raising suspicion, when the midwife finally emerged with the news that Eleanor had delivered a healthy boy, Richard had rushed upstairs, his heart pounding with fear about what he might see. The baby, wrapped in white linen, had skin that could pass for white. It was slightly darker than Eleanor's porcelain complexion, but well within the range of normal variation. The hair was curly, but not kinky. The features ambiguous enough that they could belong to either parent. Richard had felt a wave of relief, so intense it nearly knocked him over. They could do this. They could pull this off. He'd held the baby, this child of his wife, and another man, and made a decision. He would love this boy as his own. He would give him everything. Education, wealth, position. The child would never know the truth of his parentage. They named him Thomas, after Richard's father. The christening was a grand affair, with half the county in attendance. Eleanor held her son and smiled at the congratulations, all while knowing that the baby's true father was somewhere on the plantation, unable to even look at his own child. Samuel had seen Thomas only once, from a distance, when Eleanor had taken the baby out for air. Even from far away, Samuel could see himself in the child's features, the shape of the nose, the set of the eyes. His son, his boy, who would grow up calling another man father, who would inherit wealth built on the backs of enslaved people, like Samuel himself. The injustice of it burned like acid in Samuel's chest. But what could he do? Nothing. He could do nothing but watch from afar and hope the boy had a good life. The birth of Thomas changed the dynamic at Willowbrook in subtle ways. Eleanor, consumed with motherhood, had less time for secret meetings in the cottage. She still loved Samuel, still craved his touch, but the urgency had diminished. She had a child now, a piece of Samuel she could keep and hold and love openly. Even if the world thought it was Richard's, Samuel understood, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. He felt himself being pushed to the margins of Eleanor's life, becoming less lover and more guilty secret. Richard, meanwhile, threw himself into fatherhood with surprising enthusiasm. He doted on Thomas, spent hours with the boy, made plans for his education and future. If he felt any resentment about raising another man's child, he never showed it. Perhaps in some twisted way, this was his redemption. He couldn't give Eleanor a child himself, but he could give this child everything. 2 years passed. Thomas grew into a bright, active toddler. Eleanor and Samuel still met occasionally in the cottage, but the passion had cooled into something more like melancholy affection. They both knew this couldn't last forever, that eventually something would have to give. Richard continued his visits to the slave quarters, though less frequently now that he had a son to occupy his time. Lily had given birth to a daughter with skin too dark to be anything but obviously mixed race. Richard ignored the child completely, and Lily learned to hate him with a quiet, burning intensity. The other women he'd used felt similar resentment, but they were powerless to act on it. The plantation continued its daily rhythms. Cotton planted and harvested. Enslaved people worked and punished. Profits counted and reinvested. To outsiders, Willowbrook was a model of Southern prosperity and gentility, but cracks were forming in the foundation. The enslaved people of Willowbrook had not forgotten what they knew about their master's secrets. They couldn't speak openly about it, but the knowledge simmered beneath the surface, breeding resentment. Why should they be worked to death, their families torn apart, their bodies used and discarded, while the white masters indulged in their twisted arrangements and hypocrisies? The injustice of it became harder to bear. Samuel, in particular, grew increasingly bitter. He watched his son grow up, calling another man Papa, watched Eleanor lavish affection on the boy, while barely having time for him anymore. He was still enslaved, still powerless, still trapped. The arrangement that had once seemed like a gift now felt like another form of bondage. He began to think dangerous thoughts about freedom, about escape, about revenge. The breaking point came in the spring of Thomas's third year. A new overseer had been hired, a brutal man named Jessup, who believed in ruling through fear and violence. He took an immediate dislike to Samuel, perhaps sensing the foreman's education and dignity as a threat to his own authority. Jessup began looking for excuses to punish Samuel, to break him down and remind him of his place. One day, Jessup accused Samuel of stealing food from the plantation stores. It was a false accusation. The truth didn't matter. Jessup had Samuel tied to the whipping post in front of all the other enslaved people. He raised the whip, ready to deliver the first lash, when Eleanor came running from the house. She'd heard what was happening and rushed to intervene. She ordered Jessup to stop, said there must be some mistake, that Samuel was trusted and would never steal. Jessup had sneered at her, said that the mistress was too soft, that enslaved people needed firm discipline. He'd raised the whip again, and Eleanor had done something shocking. She'd stepped between Jessup and Samuel, using her own body as a shield. The plantation had gone silent. Everyone watching understood the significance of what they were seeing. A white woman didn't risk herself for an enslaved man unless there was something between them, something inappropriate, something dangerous. Jessup had lowered the whip, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and calculation. He backed down, unable to whip the mistress. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen, everyone knew. Richard, informed of the incident, had immediately fired Jessup and paid him handsomely to leave the parish and never speak of what he'd witnessed. But it was too late. The secret was out not through gossip or rumor, but through Eleanor's own actions. She'd ailed the truth in the most public way possible, and now there would be consequences. The neighboring planters began to talk. Whispers circulated at social gatherings, in churches, at business meetings. The Caldwells were odd, people said. There was something not quite right about that plantation. Some suggested Richard was weak, unable to control his wife or his property. Others hinted at darker possibilities. Eleanor found herself gradually excluded from social events. Invitations dried up. Former friends suddenly too busy to call. Richard's business relationships began to suffer as well. Men who'd once been eager to partner with him now made excuses. The Caldwells were being slowly but surely ostracized from polite society. Richard knew they couldn't continue like this. Something had to change, and soon, before the whispers became open accusations that could destroy them all.